Yeah.
Yeah. It's probably I still yeah.
I have to.
We have to change some of the question. You are getting.
Yeah, let me get started. Welcome to the UT Energy Symposium for November 8th, 2022. I'm Dr. David Tuttle from the Energy Institute here at UT Austin. Our presentation today is Lessons from the Real World. Science and nature is stronger than government policies and regulations or policymaker dreams. Before I introduce our distinguished speaker, let me give you a preview of the next few energy symposiums. November 15th, we'll have a student research symposium with two guest speakers, Matt Dean from College of Engineering and Justin Davenport from the Law School. Matt will discuss smart charging decisions for a fleet of shared autonomous electric vehicles. And Justin from the Law School will talk about federal regulation of electric transmission opportunities and obstacles under recent legislation. And then on November 29th, we'll have a book talk, America's Energy Gamble, People, Economy, and Planet by Shanti Gemper, Reverend John from the University of Pittsburgh. But let's talk about what we're doing today. So today it's my pleasure to have the Honorable Bill Flores, Vice Chair and Independent Board Member of the ERCOT Board of Directors and former member of the Congress, to discuss lessons from the real world. Science and nature are more powerful than government regulation. Some background. Government policymakers and regulators around the world have enacted numerous initiatives in attempts to mitigate climate change. These policies often fail to respect the unwavering laws of nature, particularly when it comes to energy and electricity, generating mixed, often adverse results without offsetting in a positive way impacts on emissions. We will review real-world examples of these flawed policies and their adverse impacts. Our discussion will conclude with key elements that should be respected when creating energy and climate policies. And let me give some background on the Honorable Bill Flores. William H. Bill Flores is an entrepreneur, business leader, and public policy leader. While serving in board governance and senior C-level leadership positions in the energy space, Bill helped create and save hundreds of jobs while creating billions of dollars of value for investors, pensions, and retirement funds. This experience includes domestic and international leadership roles in the formation, financing, building, restructuring, mergers and acquisitions, activities of successfully traded public entities and privately held enterprises. And then he happened to serve the state of Texas during his service as representative for the 17th Congressional District of Texas from 2011 to 2021. He served on the House Energy and Commerce Committee, the House Budget Committee, the House Natural Resources Committee, and the House Veteran Affairs Committee. Thank you for your service. His work on behalf of constituents and organizations, particularly those related to veterans and job creators, resulted in numerous recognitions for public service. Following retirement from Congress to focus on family and private sector governance positions, he's once again become active on corporate and nonprofit boards. The main thing right now, following Winter Storm Uri in 2021, the Texas Ledge restructured ERCOT's governance and its board. The most recent recognition of Bill's expertise in governance in it is his appointment not only as an independent board member of ERCOT, but also as the vice chair of the board and chair of the Finance and Audit Committee. His education includes a BBA with honors in accounting from Texas A&M and an MBA from Houston Baptist University. He's a licensed CPA and pilot. He'll navigate us around here, I'm sure very well. He's married to Gina and resides in Bryan, Texas. They have two adult sons and 4 awesome grandchildren. And his hobbies are flying and snow skiing. So I couldn't welcome you more and thank you for your time. And we'll have Q&A afterward. And please use the Q&A function and not the chat function.
You'll be monitoring that for us.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, good morning, everybody, or actually good afternoon, everybody. So I appreciate you joining us today. I think we're going to have some fun. Dr. Tuttle, would you set a timer for 35 minutes? Okay, I'm going to set my warning at 27. You'll set one for 35. Let's see. I need to get back to my presentation. Yeah. All right. Again, Dr. Tuttle introduced me. My name is Bill Flores, and I'm glad to be here today. This is my third trip to the UT campus. In the last 3 weeks, the most recent was as of last Friday, I'm on the board of the KVH Center for Energy Law and Policy. And so I get to come back here pretty often to work with students and policymakers. This is what we're going to talk about today. I'm not going to spend much time going through what we're going to talk about because I want to talk about it. Let me give you a couple of disclaimers first. The opinions you hear today are mine. They're not ERCOT's, they're not public utility commissions or the legislature, the governors, or anybody else in the Texas government.
You seem to be having on YouTube, not these slides, the other one. Oh, we have to reshare it.
Okay, I'll let you fix that. Oh, it says our screen sharing. Ah, there we go. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So my interest in being here and sharing some ideas with you is that I'm one of 26 million Texans. I care deeply about their livelihoods and their economic futures. And even though I'm an Aggie, I do try to be tripartisan. When I was in Congress, I represented the home campus of Texas A&M. I represented Baylor and also represented the Pickle Research Center, which is part of UT. And so I learned how to hook them. That was a little bit hard, but I learned how to do that as well. So again, we're going to try to have a tripartisan presentation today. A lot of people don't know what ERCOT is. So let's start with the description of what ERCOT is. This is not the reason I'm here today, but I try to educate people on clearing up some misunderstandings about what ERCOT is. ERCOT's the Electric Liability Council of Texas. You know that. It's a nonprofit corporation that's been designated by the state to serve as the independent system operator, or ISO. ERCOT manages about 90% of the Texas grid. We still have footprints of 3 other grids on the northern, western, and eastern edges of the state. About 26 million customers inside of ERCOT. It's an $18 billion electric market within the boundaries of the ERCOT region. Also, it is the 3rd largest ISO in the country measured by peak demand. People don't realize because one grid that's only 90% of one state is the 3rd largest in the country. We don't own any generation, any transmission assets, distribution asset. ERCOT is not the grid. It manages the grid. Every asset on the grid is owned by somebody else. It's just that we are the air traffic controller to say, okay, we need so many electrons distributed to these locations. So all the electrons get on the buses, these locations go over these wires and come out over here where the load is needed. That's what we do. We have limited interconnections with other grids. You heard that. It's become a campaign issue in the governor's race and some other political races in the country. If you want to ask me when we get into the Q&A session about why we are a separate grid, I'd be happy to answer that. We have 4 key responsibilities. We maintain system reliability. We maintain an active retail market, an active wholesale market, and we also provide for the interconnection of resources onto the grid. So if you want to become part of the Texas grid, you file an interconnect application, then ERCOT manages that. We have an open access grid in Texas. So if you meet certain qualifications, you're going to be allowed to either build transmission facilities or distribution facilities or generation facilities on the grid. Now, let's get into the meat of this conversation. Again, the title of my presentation today is Science and Economics are More Powerful Than Policymaker Dreams. You've got a lot of policymakers, not only at the national level, but also at state levels, certain states that seem to think that if they pass a law or a statute, or if a regulator passes a regulation, that that's going to happen, that they can somehow bend the laws of physics, that they can somehow bend the laws of economics and have a good outcome. And what I used to say on the campaign trail back when I ran the first time is that economics or that fiscal policy is like gravity. The more you violate it, the harder the impact at the end. It's the same thing here. You can't get around it. So some of the basic underpinnings of energy, electricity, and the economic opportunity is energy is a basic economic input, just like people, capital, technology, education, you name it, infrastructure. It's a basic economic input. If you mess around with it and you make it scarce or expensive, you affect the overall economy. And so you've got a well-known professor here, Scott Tinker, that last Friday at the KBH presentation said something that I picked up here in my second bullet. There are 4 essential elements in life: air, water, food, or nutrients, and energy. Without one of those, you don't have a very good life. If you look around the world, you'll see that low energy economies are also economies with low opportunity. So if you want to have a robust economy, you're going to have a robust energy infrastructure in your country as well. Today's grid, if you think about it, you've got millions of customers with hundreds of millions of pieces of load equipment. It could be charging for your smartphone or whatever. They're tied to this system that goes to a distribution system that's fed by a transmission system that's fed by, in Texas, over 1,000 generators. So if you think about it, it's the most complex machine that's ever been designed by humankind. Now, the other key element is that, and we learned this in Winter Storm Uri, is that reliability and resilience have a cost. There are some policymakers today think you got to have clean, zero carbon energy, period, end of story, full stop. When you do that, it affects your reliability and resilience. We're going to go through an example of that in just a minute. And so if you want to have a reliable, resilient grid, you've got to pay for it. Now, the flip side is true. I mean, the offset to that, of the corollary, is that if you don't have resilience and reliability, you can have a cost. It may have a low probability because low probability that it happen. But if it does happen, it's got a real high value. You multiply the two, and you get a cost. And Winter Storm Uri proved that. So we had let our policies drift to the point where our grid was less reliable, less resilient, and it had a huge human cost and economic cost. So now Texas economic growth is going to be hurt if we don't maintain focus on building a reliable and resilient, affordable, clean grid. The other thing that makes electricity sort of unique when it comes to different parts of the energy space is it's a just-in-time energy resource. You can't have a bunch of generation online producing, waiting for the load to come. It all has to match. The load has to be about the same. If you flip this switch on, you're expecting the electrons to be there. And you got to know that somebody at the other end of the line has fired up a generator to be ready to produce that electron when you need it. Now, we do have grid scale storage coming online, which has really helped this part of the equation. But in terms of being a meaningful player, it's not yet a meaningful player. Hopefully it will be soon. I think energy is, battery storage is going to be one of the features that helps us out in the future. So let me talk about what happened last summer with ERCOT, because it is, it's indicative of the challenges we face as a growing state. Our energy demand this year is up about 8% versus last year. Part of that was weather. Part of it is, everybody wants to move to Texas. So we set 38 new records this summer on the demand side. All-time April, May, June, July, August, and then the all-time weekend record, all-time weekday record. And then we set the all-time record on July the 20th, when we had 80 gigawatts of total demand. Now everybody says, what's that? What's 80 gigawatts? We'll take the total demand of New York State and California and add it together. And that was our demand, just ERCOT's demand, 90% of the state for one day in July. We had tight grid conditions on July the 11th and 13th. I want to talk more about that. Most of that was due to tight renewable output. And then the thing that I'm proudest of is that we put out a couple of conservation alerts on July the 11th, 13th, and asked people, if you can, between 2 and 8, reduce your electric demand. And boy, Texans, businesses and families stepped up and reduced total demand by half a gigawatt to about a gigawatt. You'll see why that was important in a minute. Now, here where I'm going to get into lessons from the real world. Again, you've got policymakers that think they have all the answers, and they're forgetting the underpinnings of science and economics, and they've gotten themselves into some real tight spots. So Europe is a great example of that. So what was European energy policy prior to this year? So they started phasing out coal-fired electric generation. I think we can all be in favor of that, but you need to make sure there's something else to replace it. They minimized domestic fossil fuel exploration production. Here in Texas, we're a big oil and gas producer. They don't do that in Europe. So they've actually banned the exploration production of fossil fuels. That's okay if you have reliable replacement. If you don't have reliable replacement, you've reduced your options, and optionality is important. They shuttered their nuclear, or they set themselves up to shutter their nuclear electric generation. For the life of me, I don't know why you do that. If you want to have zero emissions, baseload power, nuclear is the way to go. And we'll have more of a conversation about that. They required the rapid expansion of renewable generation. That's all cool. But you got to realize you need balance in everything that you do. Not only do you need to have your traditional generation resources like nuclear, gas, and coal, really coal now if you want to, but you need to have, along with the renewables, you got to have a balance in there. And then they started a rapid transition of their transportation fleet away from fossil fuel resources to electricity. And so by doing this, they ignored the optionality that you need when you have energy. All of us need options. And so if you decide, okay, we're going to phase all these things out, we're not going to produce domestic energy, that means you're going to rely on somebody else for that. And so the EU got to be reliant on Russia. And Russia's turned out to be a very unreliable energy partner since they invaded Ukraine. So when all of you are young budding grid designers or grid personnel, or you're going to be in the energy space, or you're going to be a policymaker, always remember optionality as well as science and economics. And they moved ahead of energy, the technology that's available. They said, okay, we're going to go this way. We're going to put in these kinds of renewables. And what they should have done is said, our goal is to make energy more affordable and clean, and not pick the technology, be technology agnostic. Instead, they pick the technology and it's hurt them moving forward. Now, what are the outcomes? They've got high energy prices, 10x what it was a year ago. Think about that. If your family's energy bill went up by a factor of 10 in 1 year, think about the impact that has on your family, your business, the country's economy. So what's happening now in some countries, they're deindustrializing. They're saying, okay, I can't afford to produce in this high energy environment, particularly the cost of natural gas. So I'm having to export my business to other countries, typically to Asia. So you've got lower crop production, higher food prices. Now, why do you have lower crop production? What do you need for crops and food? Fertilizer. Where's fertilizer come from? Natural gas. So again, if you forget to maintain good optionality, you can wind up getting in a position where you get a little hungry. They got over reliant, as we talked about, an unstable fuel provider, Russia. One of the things they're having to do now is they're reactivating coal-fired production. So they're getting dirtier. So they have government energy subsidies and price caps, and those don't work in the long term. I mean, they'll suppress prices for a while, but all they do is they slide the problem to the right. And so the problem, the shortage, if you will, of supply versus demand is going to get worse as you go through farther. Now, the good news out of this is some of the EU countries are rethinking their anti-nuclear policy and anti-natural gas policy. So if, again, my bias is nuclear. If you want to have clean, affordable baseload power with no emissions, you go nuclear. Some countries are rethinking it. Germany's not. Germany's doubled down on we're not going to have nuclear. We're going to continue to shut our plants down. Look, if Gavin Newsom in California can get comfortable with nuclear at Diablo Canyon, the Germans ought to be able to get comfortable with that. So let's move forward. All right, some more outcomes. They've got reduced economic output, their unemployment's going through the roof. They've got inflation, energy shortages. They're going to have some hunger challenges this summer, maybe not in Europe, but the spillover in Europe will be able to afford to buy food. But if they price regional food too high, then that backs up into Africa. So you could actually have famine in Africa. The other thing that happens when you lose your optionality when it comes to an energy resource, think natural gas in Russia, your ability to exert diplomatic and military influence on others is reduced. So it's going to be hard for Europe. Europe's done a pretty good job of this, but it's getting more and more tenuous with respect to Ukraine. So they're having trouble figuring out, okay, how long can we suffer this pain? Particular policymakers, how long can we impose this pain on our population? Because we have made some bad policy choices and energy prices are high. So they are being careful diplomatically and militarily, their options are reduced. So we don't have that problem in this country. We're still an energy dominant country, but the European countries are having that issue. Of course, they got adverse trade balance, supply chain vulnerabilities. And what's really interesting about all this is at the end of the day, European emissions are higher than they were before because you've got people burning wood like crazy. You are burning coal. They set up their coal plants again to burn. By the way, those of you that are watching us virtually, we have a camera misfire, so you can't, I mean, you see me, but you see me from a long distance away. I'm sorry about that. But, and then you've seen some countries have had social unrest. So let's go to another example of something that could have gone really wrong. It didn't, but it could go really wrong. So we're going to talk about the Texas grid for a minute. So I took a snapshot of what the grid looks like on July the 1st. This column right here. The first column is the makeup of our generation fleet. As you can see, we've got nuclear, natural gas total, and that's total of 77 gigawatts of what we call dispatchable power. Dispatchable power is something that has an on-off switch, not necessarily instantly. It may be 24 hours to ramp up, but it's something where ERCOT can call, say, we need more power, Scotty. And I'm getting you watch Star Wars, but Star Trek. But anyway, so and they can get scheduled to bring that online. And then we've got about 50 gigawatts of intermittent power. So think wind and solar and some other cats and dogs in the other. So total generation capacity is 127 gigawatts. Now, how did that perform on our two tight days of July the 11th and July the 13th? On July the 11th, our total dispatchable was producing at 87% of nameplate capacity. Our wind was at 3%. We had 897 megawatts of wind available that day. We had about 9.5 gigawatts of solar and about 1.6 gigawatts of other, about 49%. So our total generation capability was about 79 gigawatts. Our demand was 73. We had 5.4 gigawatts of reserves, which means we were at about our reserve level was about 7%. We like to maintain about 15% in ERCOT. Now, what happened on July the 13th? We had a little bit different story. We had more wind, but we had less solar. And so, again, you look at our dispatchable fleet was at 87%, 67 gigawatts. So it was churning right along. We had about 5 gigawatts of wind. We had about 6.7 gigawatts of solar. And so our total intermittent was about 11.6 gigs. The mandate, total fleet was producing about 79 gigawatts. Here's where things get interesting. Total demand, 78 gigawatts. We had that much left. If people hadn't conserved, we could have been in a real bind here. So we have about 1% of excess capacity or reserve capacity. So I say that as just so that you understand a baseline. Because some people will say we can make some policymakers think we can make certain policy decisions without paying attention to the real world operations of the grid, the real world physics and thermodynamics of the grid. So I'm going to give you some examples of things I've heard people say they can do. They say we can have a 100% renewable grid. So here's example one. So I just assumed for a minute that, so I built 3 new grids, for examples, to apply to July the 11th and July the 13th. This is the first hypothetical. This one says we take today's wind and solar and scale it up to replace all the dispatchable that we used to have. Now, I kept nuclear just to make some people mad because I loved it. So I kept nuclear there. I assumed it produced 100% like it did on July the 11th and 13th. And then I scaled up wind and solar to 91 gigs and 31 gigs respectively. So you still have a 127 gigawatt capacity grid. Then I applied the performance factors here on July the 11th to the grid. Lights out for 56% of the state, 50% of the ERCOT region. The other thing, so on July the 13th, 54% were out. So again, 3% of the wind came online, 81% of the solar. Over here, 14% of the wind, 57% of the solar. Lights out. All right. And well, the retort from somebody went, well, we'd never build a grid that. Okay, fine. So let's build another grid. So hypothetical 2 is, let's build a grid that's 50% solar, 50% wind. Now, one of the things I didn't put in this is batteries, and they'll help. And we'll talk about batteries in a minute because they are a net help to the grid. So you have 61 gigawatts of wind, 61 gigawatts of solar. You got 5 gigawatts of nuclear, so 127 gigawatt grid again. Now you apply the performance factors from the 11th and the 13th, and what happened? Lights out 24%, lights out 38%, or in this case, no air conditioning. So that doesn't work. So somebody said, well, we wouldn't build that grid. So just for fun, we at ERCOT, we have what we call an interconnect application queue, or the IAQ for short. I just assumed that what I did is I took everything that's in that queue and said that 100% of it gets approved and 100% of it gets capital behind it, 100% of it gets built, and 100% of it comes online. Those are all greens, by the way, because it'll never happen. And so we have 57 gigawatts of wind. We only have a little bit of wind in the interconnect queue, a ton of solar. So 110 gigawatts of solar. And then, so instead of 127 gigawatt grid, we've got 190 gigawatt grid. Everybody with me so far? Okay, so then I applied the characteristics of July the 11th and the 13th. And in both cases, the grid survived. Over here, got a little tight because we have a heavy reliance on solar. Again, our goal is to have 15% reserves. So there's no telling how much that grid would cost. Let's go into that. What are the challenges to each of those 3 grids, those hypothetical grids I described? Because again, US policymakers or engineers or business persons are going to have to deal with these questions. So these are the constraints, the questions they have to answer, the things that are left out. So grids have inertia. When you take your foot off the gas of the car, it doesn't screech to a stop unless you have a test on the bad mode. It doesn't screech to a stop. It has inertia, it keeps rolling. It goes past the bumps or whatever. Grids have inertia. That inertia is coming from your dispatchable power, your nuclear, your natural gas, and coal, because you've got a big spinning piece of equipment that's producing it. An inverter-based system today, it's inverter-based systems from wind and solar don't have inertia. And inertia is needed for the grid so that when you flip that switch on, or button, you have a million people flip their switches on at one time, the grid can absorb that. If it has inertia, if it doesn't have inertia, things get a little more dicey. So that grid, those hypotheticals I described don't have inertia except for that one nuclear plant. That's not enough to make it work. How does this grid perform in the winter? You're in the summertime, we all know what our load demand is. Load comes up during the day and then peels off at night. In the winter, you have one hump in the morning and then you have another hump at night. What is it? How's this grid going to perform? I didn't take the time to do that. I was just using July 11th, 13th as a summertime example. But it would perform differently. But you, as the policymaker, the engineer, the business person, are going to have to figure that out and make sure that question is answered. What are our nighttime grid resources? Remember that this last one here, you got a boatload of solar. How's it? Solar's not on at night. The free fuel didn't show up on the night. So how's the grid going to behave at night? What are your transmission farms? Think about where you have to locate all those resources, all those solar farms, and all those wind transmission locations are in West Texas. And you've got to build high tension lines to get them from there to the load centers down here in the economic triangle of Texas. That will cost tens of billions, not hundreds of billions of dollars. Not only for the generation connections, but also but there's massive transmission requirements. And the other problem that you have in every state, Texas as well, is a NIMBY problem. Nobody wants a high tension line in their backyard or across a ranch or farm. Then you've got land use ecological impacts, both on the generation side and transmission side. So for wind, it takes about 200 tons of stuff per megawatt to build a generator. To generate it, the wind takes about 6 tons of stuff for combined cycle natural gas. So again, we need to have stuff, as Scott Tinker was talking about last Friday, is getting us into renewable power is not really renewable because you go mine a bunch of stuff and you manufacture this stuff, then you're producing energy with it, and then you dump the stuff when you're done. It's not really renewable. So you got to think, where's all that stuff coming from, and what do you do with it when you get the life cycle of stuff? So you've got supply chain capabilities. What's our supply chain to produce all that stuff? How are we going to get the rare earth minerals and all the things it takes to produce that grid, those hypothetical grids? What are the critical materials? How much of it do we have domestically? How do we have enough capital? How much of that interconnect application do you actually gets built, gets capital invested as we move forward? And then the really important thing is, what's the affordability for customers, the regulators? They care about this stuff. Now, one of the potential resources that's helpful all this, we got about 74 gigawatts of wind in the interconnect application queue of storage. That's helpful. Storage is particularly good when you connect it, when you interface it with solar, because if you think about like in the wintertime, your solar ramp in the evening, your solar's falling off real quickly, but at the same time you've got load coming up. And if you have a couple hours of batteries out there, you can bridge that. But again, batteries take materials, and then they also take land, and then they also take what do you do with the stuff when you're done? So it's helpful. I didn't model it because we're still trying to figure out ERCOT. Batteries are a resource and are a load because you got to charge them sometime. And so that's something that needs to be taken into consideration. So as a Policymaker, here are the laws that policymakers forget about. Again, the laws of economics and the laws of science will trump what the policymaker dreams are. So signal law, thermodynamics, Kirchhoff's laws, Coulomb's, Ampere's, Ohm's, Faraday's, all that. So you engineers know this stuff. Those are the laws those are the laws that policymakers need to pay attention to. If you violate those, you're going to have a flawed law or flawed regulation. And another one is, this is something to keep in mind, is that there is a professor at OSU, Roger Kilke, who came up with this quote. He said, this is the iron law of climate policy. If a consumer's faced with policies that produce clean energy, they'll say, yeah, we want it. But if they have faced with the choice of affordable energy, they're going to choose affordable. So again, we as policymakers need to think about what's the balance. So we're all out here and we're all in the room designing the grid of the 21st century. We need to keep that in mind as well. So here are other things that can't be ignored. Energy density. If I have a piece of uranium the size of that thumb, that's a ton of coal. Energy density is important in terms of not only the fuel, but also the land use as well. You got to think about transmission losses. If you build all your generation up in West Texas, you're going to lose a lot of that power when it gets down to the load center. You got to think about the emissions characteristics of everything. So everything that you do has an emissions characteristic, whether you're building wind generators or solar farms or nuclear power plants or whatever, or you're operating a natural gas facility, natural gas generation, you're going to have an impact. What's the availability of capital to build this stuff? What's the land use? What are the input materials? We talked about that. And then what are the ecological impacts? Think about it. So if you build a big solar farm, I'm not anti-renewable. I'm the second largest producer of solar power in Brazos County, Texas. If you cover up a bunch of land with solar, something used to be living on that ground. What's the ecological impact on that? And then when you look at the ecological impact of your decisions, think from the time you acquire the stuff out of the ground, all the way through when you manufacture it and use it, and then when you get rid of it in. Don't just measure from when you turn the switch on to when you turn it off. You got to measure the full cycle of ecological impact. And people, think about the impact on people. They, like I said before, they sort of care about this stuff. Now, here are things for policymakers to think about. This will repeat. Energy is a basic economic input. Policymakers forget that. Policymakers think, yeah, we can reduce the amount of energy that everybody uses, and it won't have any impact. When you do that, you lower economic opportunity. And again, reliability and resilience have cost. People think you build this wonderful new grid that's totally based on wind, for instance, let's say, but it's not reliable and it's not resilient. Bad energy equals policy. Bad energy policy has bad outcomes. Your high price, reduced reliability, reduced resilience, famine, social unrest, increased emissions, et cetera. Just think their bad energy policy produced all that. So don't be a bad policy. Our goal should be to have reliable, resilient, affordable, abundant, clean, low emissions energy. And so, as Scott Tinker said last Friday, and I'm stealing this from him, but I'm giving credit attribution for it. We should make affordable energy cleaner. That should be the goal of policy. Make affordable energy cleaner. Don't try to pick the winners and losers, but just try to say these are our standards and let technology and innovation fill the gap. And so one of the solutions is all the above energy systems based on real science, real economics, and real full cycle environmental impact. If you have those analyses, you'll have good energy policy. And I think, and this is Bill Flores' opinion, nuclear and hydrogen need to be in that toolkit. Now, here's some other things that need to be part of the toolkit as well. Conservation, battery storage. Again, we got 74 gigawatts in our queue here in Texas. We need to make sure we learn how to operate it pretty well. It helped us out on July the 11th and 13th at our critical times in the afternoon. That storage was there, producing electrons into the system. And so about 3 weeks ago, I was fortunate to be able to go look at Jupiter's newest launch facility out in West Texas. And it's pretty neat to see what you can do on relatively small footprints. That's one of the solutions, but we can't focus solely on that. We need to look at controllable load resources. Think a data center that can shift up and down usage, or a Bitcoin mine. Bitcoin mines can turn off like that. Think about that. we need to think about distributed energy resources. Some people can produce, if you set up an industrial facility, say down in the Houston Ship Channel, you might be able to have your gen set there and you can produce power for yourself. And then when call those tight times, you can feed back into the grid. So that's something to think about. Another thing that's really neat, we're doing this in Texas, this is pretty innovative, I think. We just approved this at our last ERCOT board meeting, and the PUC just approved it a couple of weeks ago, or a few weeks ago. Take distributed energy resources on a small scale. Think your solar system on your house, think your Tesla that's plugged in at your house, or think your Tesla Powerwall. Those all have resource capabilities, and they can feed back into the grid to help out at tight times. And so we're running this pilot project for what we call ADERs, aggregated distributed energy resources, here in Texas. We're going to run it for the next 3 years or so and see, is there a way to do this? Now, the key for all these things is, in order for these to be useful for us as policymakers or us as people that are part of the grid or manage the grid, you've got to be able to see it. It's got to be predictable, and you got to be able to see it in order to be able to control it. For instance, it's okay if you got 1 million power walls out there, it doesn't do you much good if you can't see them and you can't predict their behavior and you can't control them. So those are things you need to think about as policymakers. You've got to be able to see this stuff and to predict this behavior, and to some extent have some command and control over it to be able to do it. And I say that carefully. Questions?
Perfect timing.
Did I hit the minutes?
Can you explain ready kilowatt for those who may not?
Yeah. Have you ever seen this little dude down here? Okay, well, back when I was growing up at the beginning of the industrialization of the world, when we were, the electric companies used to advertise, buy more appliances, use more electricity, and ready kilowatt was sort of the logo they used to encourage people to use electricity. So that's ready kilowatt.
That was an era where they were trying to advertise all the wonders that electrification can provide.
Yeah.
And so really,
Yeah.
we got some questions here.
Okay.
The Stanford study has said that 100% renewable can be done. How can this be possible with the need for inertia? And by the way, there are those studies that we both know questionable, but
Like I can do a spreadsheet, and I can design a grid that will be 100% renewable. But is it 100% reliable? No, it's not. And so I have, I looked at the Stanford study, again, just at the 50,000 foot level, but it leaves out some of those elements that we talked about. Okay, how much transmission does it take? Where are you going to get the inertia from to keep it running through the bumps in the road that grids go through? And so and how much does it cost? And how much material, how much stuff does it take? I used to like to use Professor Tinker's words, how much stuff to build that grid. And so why worry about that? Why don't we focus on, we want a certain level of reliability, we want a certain level of resilience, and we want it to be affordable, and we want it to be clean, we want to have low emissions profile. And then like technology and innovation design that grid for us, rather than us say, we got to have 100%, because that'll create a more expensive, less reliable, less resilient, more expensive grid.
next question. There's widespread agreement that energy efficiency helps reduce the demand side burden of extreme weather events you described, and also reduces the daily peak load requirements, reduces customer bills, requires less grid infrastructure, et cetera. It isn't necessarily great for utilities since there's less product to sell and revenue. What are your thoughts about how we can increase energy efficiency investments across ERCOT?
Okay, the best way to increase energy efficiency is to somehow incentivize it, recognize it, incentivize it. So, some states use time of day pricing. And that if you're a consumer, you're not going to run your washer and dryer and your dishwasher during the middle of the day when your pricing is higher. So my view of the world, again, this is because there's a lot of people in Texas disagree with this, is time of day pricing encourages efficiency. Take an aspirational goal and turn it into an economic change the economic behavior of people, and that's a huge conservation. Pricing.
And next, any questions here? Because I'll keep rolling.
Yes, sir.
Do you think that grid reliability is more a function of increased capacity or increased efficiency?
In today's world, it's capacity. That's the challenge we have. You go back to some of the spreadsheets I showed you earlier. If you look at that, as the economics from renewables have hurt the economics of the dispatchable tranche of energy. And so you're seeing a decrease in those generation resources and increase in the renewables. And so that capacity reallocation has hurt reliability and resilience. Okay. Next question.
Do you include any cost of carbon emissions in your models? What value should be assigned to avoiding a ton of carbon emissions? In your opinion, what would be the maximum safe parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere?
Oh, I'm not smart enough to answer the last part of the question. I mean, there were people who said, we're gonna get in trouble, we get 3.6, some say we're gonna get if we get over 4, we're gonna have problems. Climate change is happening. Nature's gonna respond to that somehow. People are gonna need to have to somehow deal with that. I think there's 2 parts to dealing with carbon emissions. One is mitigation, and the other was adaptation. And technology and innovation will help us solve both of those problems. Your typical policymaker is not going to be smart enough or have the foresight 100 years out to be able to make those decisions and make that happen. In terms of the price of carbon, I am not. I think it's okay to put a price of carbon on looking at emission resources. So let's say if I'm going to build a natural, let me use this example. Because my perfect example is a small modular reactor. By the way, one got approved in Canada this in the past few days. I was pretty pumped about that, although it doesn't help us. But if I'm comparing a nuclear plant to let's say a natural gas facility without carbon capture and sequestration, if you had a carbon price, then that might help this one. But again, that's manipulated economics. I'd like for us to have just set a reliability goal and an emissions goal, and then let the market and science handle that versus trying to put an artificial price of carbon. The other thing too is, let's say I'm building a combined cycle natural gas plant. If there's a price of carbon, I'm probably going to find a way to use carbon capture and sequestration to keep the carbon out of the air. So those are the ways that pricing carbon would work. Anybody else in here?
Got more here, but
Yes, sir.
It's like a political policy question.
By the way, I hope y'all voted. So go ahead.
I noticed that the use of renewable energy and all this, it's becoming more and more partisan. And seeing as you're clearly pro renewable energy and that you're also a Republican congressman, what do you think we can do to try to keep I don't know, as much as we can, the partisanness out of something as important as just a functioning energy grid and clean energy and all that?
Yeah, I think if we could get everybody, I'm talking about the most important people, the people in this room, the people that are the voters, and we'll get everybody to understand that what we need is balance. And the number one thing we want is reliability and resilience. And then we want affordability, and then we want it to be clean. Clean meaning low carbon, low emissions. I think we can get, everybody agrees on that. I don't know of anybody that wouldn't agree to those 4 attributes. If we get people to focus on that, then we can sort of restructure the policy debates and say, it's gotta be renewable, or I hate renewables. So that's what's happening. Like I put my first solar system on in 2009, but it would have never paid out, but I was a geek and I could afford to do it. And I kind of like that stuff. But I don't want to frame that decision down to anybody else. That should be an economic judgment call that each individual family makes, in my opinion. But if we, one of the things that's wrong with all politics today, everybody's focusing on their differences. When at the end of the day, we agree on about 70 or 80% of the stuff here in the middle. And we focus on that and quit worrying about this fringy crap on the side. I think we'd have a lot better outcomes as a country, but it's more fun to fight. Not me, I'm just saying, you're typical, not typical, but you've got some elements of the elected class that make money, raise money by fighting or get elected by fighting. If they would think about who they work for instead of trying to get reelected, then you'd have what John Boehner used to call do the right thing at the right time for the right reasons. Good things will happen, meaning good policy decisions equal good political outcomes. If we could get people to do that, we'd be better off.
Next question is, what's an acceptable electricity reliability for consumers? Is it 0.9999? How many nines? Or can current Texas government policy and ERCOT resources meet this?
The acceptable standard though that most people use is called 1 in 10, which is 1 day of disruption over 10 years. And I don't know how many nines that is. Somebody, one of y'all can do the math, let us have the answer, but there's a lot of nines to that. So that,
Next question.
well, but to answer the rest of the question is what can ERCOT do? ERCOT is not a policymaking body. ERCOT is an executor. So the state legislature, well, federal government sets some policy that affects Texas, but we're not part of FERC, but it does set some policy that affects Texas. Then the state legislature sets policy for Texas. Then the Public Utility Commission sets energy and water policy, electricity and water policy. And then ERCOT implements the electric policy that comes out of the PUC. So what the PUC is working on, I'm pretty excited about this. So if you look at Senate Bill 3 and some of the other bills that the legislature passed, they changed the governance of the PUC, and then they restructured what the PUC could do to change market design in Texas. And so the PUC, right after Uri, after it was restructured, passed phase 1 of market redesign to help the grid survive the tight spots we had in the winter and also last summer. They did a good job with that. This week, actually 2 days, they're going to roll out market redesign phase 2. And I'm pretty excited about that because what they're going to do, I'm not going to tell you everything. Not allowed to do that. But they're basically saying reliability is an inherent part of our grid. And if you want to be part of our grid, you've got to produce reliable power. That's all I'll say. But policy in Texas is influenced by that. I think PUC's done a really good job. They may be bumping against the edges of the statutes that were passed in the last legislature. And we may have to go back to the legislature and ask for broader authority for the PUC in order to maintain the desired reliability. At the end of the day, you've got to encourage the development market where people put steel in the ground to build reliable generation resources, whatever that is. Is it nuclear? Is it wind with batteries? Is it solar with that? What is it that makes it reliable? Okay.
Sure, we've got one question. Yeah, sure. Already answered. Any other questions in here? Okay, what about, so a recent study from a colleague of mine calculated that there were $27 billion in savings over, say, the past decade from wind and solar helping to reduce wholesale prices. That's a 4x payback for the $7 billion in CREZ. Do you see any kind of appetite for CREZ 2 to help out, maybe diversify?
We're going to need, first of all, I've seen the headlines for the study. I haven't read the study. It's on my reading list. Oh wait, I've got some reading lists for you here in a minute. I think we need more CREZ, yes. But CREZ is part of everything else we talk about. Again, it's balance. We need more nuclear. We need more storage. We need more solar. But it's got to be balanced. And again, before you connect to the grid, you got to say, okay, it's going to be this percentage reliable to do that.
So we only have a few minutes, but we got a lot of questions.
Okay.
So since you are familiar with voltaics, what about agrivoltaics? Do you see any of that happening in Texas and especially the colleges that are strong in agriculture? Are they doing anything?
I don't know what agrivoltaics are. I will tell you this, brings up another issue. When you look at climate change, there's 2 ways to control carbon. One is to not emit it or reduce emission. Another way is to eat it here on the ground. And nature does a pretty good job of that with agriculture. So if you think about, and this freaks a lot of people out, but if you think about modifying nature to help eat more carbon, that's a potential solution. So, but that freaks a lot of people out because they see man-eating plants instead of carbon-eating plants. So
Next question. So
what is
agrivoltaics? It's
Yeah.
where you just can grow things underneath the solar panels.
Oh, that, okay, that makes sense. Okay,
And it takes.
that would help.
Yeah.
Something to eat carbon.
Okay, there's a large flexible load work with the ERCOT. And I hope they're looking into this. I just wonder if you have any opinions or data on that. Crypto mining is an interesting type of new flexible large
Yeah, it
load.
is.
But how do you get it to where they don't freeload on their T and D burden by shutting off at the 4CP
Yeah.
measurement points?
Let me say this, and I like what crypto has done to stabilize the grid. Because what they're typically doing is they are absorbing excess electrons during peak times of high wind, high solar production. And that allows the rest of the grid to remain more stable. But if we get tight conditions, they shut off and they do it pretty quickly. So I think they're a net beneficiary. But yeah, but all industry is able to use 4CP to opt out of paying their TP costs or T costs. And so something tells me the legislature needs to look at that, see if that's fair. I don't know. That's one of those that's kind of above my pay grade at this one time. I'm a net proponent of crypto mining in Texas, because again, I think it's a great stabilizer. In terms of the 4CP policy, I don't really have an opinion on that.
Okay. And then batteries, because we were talking about that. Do you see a sweet spot somewhere 4 to 6 to 8 hours? Or, I mean, you can't get too long because of economics, but there's a certain amount that needs to have durations really help.
Right.
Where do you see the sweet spot?
Oh. If you think of, well, the sweet spot in wintertime be 14 hours. Yeah, so, well, think of that, nighttime. So, to go beyond that, I mean, you're talking lots of materials, lots of land, a lot of transmission, and then you got to charge all this stuff. So, from a practical standpoint, the sweet spot is probably 6 hours. Let's say you had a big line of thunderstorm move through West Texas, big system with multiple lines, and that kills your solar output. A 6 to 7 hour duration would probably make it work. That's a lot of batteries. And today, all the batteries, you go look at a battery facility, they all have the little Chinese characters on the side. We need to make it here. We're gonna do that. No offense, Chinese.
Okay. Any questions in here? Because I can keep rolling. Okay, there's sometimes talk about making renewables pay for their intermittency. And it's kind of undefined what that means, paying for their backup. But the analogy I would think of is we have a lot of cotton farming in Texas, and cotton competes with synthetic fibers. We don't really ask Texas cotton farmers to pay for nylon producers if they have nature making so they can't grow cotton. I can understand some aspect of resiliency, but what does it really mean? And what do you think will be implemented in terms of making renewables pay for their intermittency?
I don't know. I think we need to flip that and say, instead of renewables paying for their intermittency, make every generator that wants to put electrons in the Texas grid meet a reliability standard. And if they can't through their physical generation resource, then they can buy it. So that's what I think needs to happen, is to do that.
Fantastic. Any other questions? We'll join the meeting thanking our distinguished
Okay.
speaker.
If you're interested in some other reading for research, you can take a picture of this if you'd like to. You can go to the ERCOT website to look at how the grid is doing on any particular day. There's a documentary called Pandora's Promise that's produced by a friend of mine out in California, and it tells the truth about nuclear. So it's about an hour and 20 minutes long, but you can get it on all the normal places, iTunes, YouTube, so forth. So download it and take a look at it. If you want to know about the modern grid, how it came around, read The Emergence of Power. Samuel Insull, Thomas Edison, the creation of the modern metropolis. Uh, so I didn't say, hey Siri, I don't think. Then there's a local author named Robert Bryce. He has a podcast called Power Hungry Podcast. I listen to quite a bit. He's written a book called The Question of Power, Electricity, and Wealth of Nations. That's another great resource. A couple of environmental resources that are interesting. A book called Unsettled by Stephen Koonin, who is an environmental activist. And then Michael Schellenberger, I think many of you have heard of him. He and I have been on the same dais before in presentations. And he's written a book called Apocalypse Never, talking about some of the distortions that come out of the COP reports. It's pretty interesting. This book, I've got 20 minutes left to go on. I'm reading an audio, but it's been fascinating. It's called Shorting the Grid by Meredith Angwin. This book does two things. It focuses on ISO New England, but it basically tells you the building blocks of the grid. And then it talks about how to build stable grids and unstable grids. It's pretty fascinating to read. And she got kind of an interesting style. If you want to look at what is happening in California, California Burning by Catherine Blunt is an interesting book. I just finished reading that, talking about PGE and the fires that have been out in California. Let's see. If you want to do some research, if any of your engineering students, graduating engineering students want to do some research, here's some things that you can think about. Remember those grids, those hypothetical grids that these questions were unanswered. Go do some research, answer those questions. And you can take a picture of that if you want to link with me on LinkedIn. I think I'm done.
You're done. Great, fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.